Got it? Okay. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming tonight for this very special presentation. My name is Darlene Chanfold, and I'm the current chair of the North Olympic Group, which covers Jefferson and Clallam County. And before I say any more, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the First Nations here in Jefferson and Clallam County. That includes the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, the Makah tribe, the Quileute tribe, and the Hoh tribe. And if the rest of you would like to acknowledge, please put that in the chat where you are and the tribes that are whose land you are on. Again, welcome. What we're going to do tonight is have a 30-minute presentation, more or less, and a 30-minute Q&A. And then we will break into, because SnoIsle and NOG have their business meetings right after, Tom Crisp is going to set us up in different rooms. So if those of you in our groups that want to stay, please do. And I want to thank Tom and Peter for their wonderful technical abilities, because we couldn't do this without them. So thank you, Tom and Peter. Nancy Johnson with SnoIsle wants to say a few words.
I just wanted to welcome everyone. This is great to have the two groups collaborating tonight, and our SnoIsle group will be meeting after after chat is finished and we're done with questions and answers, and we'll be doing our regular rundown of events and actions that you can take. So look forward to seeing you after the presentation as well. Thank you so much. And Darlene, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. It was last year I was reading this wonderful book. It wasn't yours, Chad. It was called Finding the Mother Tree by a Canadian scientist. Let me see, Suzanne Simard. And right after that, I heard an interview on the radio with Chad, and I thought, oh, I need to learn more. So I went out and got the book, and I had the library order it as well, and thought this would make a wonderful presentation for us. And I was able to contact Chad, and he immediately agreed to give us a presentation. A synopsis of his presentation reads like this: natural fires are as essential as sun and rain and fire adapted forests. But as humans encroach on wild spaces, fear, arrogance, and greed have shaped the way that people view these regenerative events and have given rise to misinformation. The peril that these myths pose to forests is profound, affecting whole habitats and the wildlife that depend on them. The exploitation of these carbon dioxide absorbing ecosystems also threatens humanity's chance of overcoming the climate crisis. Dr. Chad Hanson will address these issues and suggest a better, science-based, and more hopeful path forward, as he discusses in his new book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildlife Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Dr. Hanson is a research ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute, located in Big Bear City, California. He has a PhD in ecology with a research focus on fire ecology in conifer forest ecosystems. Dr. Hanson has published dozens of peer-reviewed studies on forest and fire ecology, and is also the co-editor and co-author of a 2015 book entitled The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. Dr. Hanson.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight to talk about forest and fire ecology and climate science. I'm going to share my screen now and bring up my presentation. Hopefully that goes just fine. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Chad Hanson. I'm a forest and fire ecologist and climate scientist, and I work on the aspect of climate science that we call natural climate solutions, and basically the importance of natural ecosystems of all types, but especially forests, to absorb more of that excess CO2 in our atmosphere and to help mitigate the climate crisis. And of course, I talk about this a lot more in my book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And that's available on Amazon and bookshop.com and by the publisher as well, University Press, Kentucky. And so just briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got involved in this work, which I go into some detail on this in the prologue of the Smokescreen book. But my older brother and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada in 1989. And I took a year off college to do that. I was not politically active. I was very naive. I didn't know the difference between a national forest and a national park. And I found out the hard way that on national forests, the U.S. Forest Service is quite literally in the commercial logging business, selling public trees to private logging companies and keeping the revenue for its budget. And we saw the devastating impacts of that system as we got further north on the trail into northern Sierra Nevada and into Oregon and Washington, all the way up to Canada on national forests. And I resolved somewhere along the line on the trail, and I remember a particular moment on the Willamette National Forest in Oregon, sitting on a 6-foot diameter stump and looking at nothing but stumps in every direction around me, all the way up to the ridge lines, that I was going to be involved in forest protection for the rest of my life. So I've been doing that ever since. And that's us, of course, 3 days from the Canadian border, looking much, much thinner and more tired. And I've been working on this issue ever since. But what I came to understand is that so many of the arguments that the Forest Service and the logging industry began to use to promote the logging were basically arguments that fundamentally had to be addressed scientifically. And that's what ultimately led me back to graduate school and to get my PhD in ecology. I've been researching this for a couple of decades now. First thing I want to talk about here, just right up front, is the importance of focusing on homes and the immediate zone around homes within 100 feet in terms of protecting communities from wildfire. And this, of course, is an issue all across the country. It's not just in the West, but and it's not just in California. It's in the Pacific Northwest, it's in the Northern Rockies, it's in the Southwest, it's in Tennessee. And this is an issue in Florida. And the science is telling us very loudly and clearly the only effective way to protect homes and public safety from wildfires in communities is to help homeowners make their homes more fire safe, more fire resistant, what we call home hardening. Basic steps like fire resistant roofing. A lot of homes already have fire resistant roofing, but you need to sweep the dry leaves and pine needles off the roof during fire season and get that off of there. Simple things like rain gutter guards to prevent dry leaves and pine needles from accumulating in rain gutters. And then, of course, defensible space, pruning of vegetation within 100 feet of the home. And it's not about removing trees. It's about removing lower limbs and some seedlings and saplings and dry grasses and dry leaves and needles and twigs on the forest floor. And the other one, of course, is ember-proof vents. For a few $100s, a lot of the homes could be saved just by that one thing alone, to prevent those flaming embers that are driven by the winds from being blown into an attic space, for example, with those old coarse wire mesh vents from the 1970s or 80s. Those were really, really dangerous. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, can everyone hear me just fine? I want to make sure that my bandwidth is fine in terms of the audio. Okay, good, thanks. So this is just one example among many. And of course, I know you all heard in one fashion or another the tales of tragedy from communities being impacted by wildland fires. And this, of course, was one of the worst ever. This was the 2018 Camp Fire, burning over 14,000 homes and costing 86 lives in the town of Paradise in Northern California. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in the years before the Camp Fire occurred, thousands and thousands of acres on public and private lands had been logged in the previous years under the guise of thinning and post-fire logging under the rubric of fuel reduction. And the communities were told that all this tree removal of live trees, removal of dead trees, that was going to save them from fire. It would act as a fuel break, and it would reduce fuel, and it would make the fire burn much lower in intensity and make it slow down so much that it would be easy for the fire suppression forces to put it out. And they wouldn't have to worry about the fire reaching the community. That's what they were told. That's what communities all across the country are being told. And that is a very dangerous falsehood. It didn't happen that way in Paradise. In fact, the areas that had been logged under the guise of fuel reduction, thinning, post-fire logging, those are the areas that burned the most intensely. That's where the fire spread fastest on its way to the town. And people had, as a consequence, very, very little time to evacuate. And that had tragic consequences. We saw the same thing last year in the northern Sierra Nevada, in a little town called Grizzly Flats, in the Caldor fire. And you can see that little community on the western side of the fire area there, Grizzly Flats. It was surrounded by thousands of acres of commercial thinning that was done on the El Dorado National Forest by the U.S. Forest Service. Once again, community told, this will save you from fire. You don't need to worry. And so people didn't do their defensible space pruning. They didn't do their ember-proof vents and other home hardening steps that we know from the science are effective. And now Grizzly Flats is mostly gone. It was mostly burned in the Caldor fire. That was preventable. And so was what happened in Paradise. Same thing last year, further north in the Sierra Nevada, in a little town called Greenville, a town I know well. I used to stay there when I was doing my field research for my doctoral dissertation. And you can see in both Greenville and both the Caldor fire and the Dixie fire, these yellow and orange areas, those are areas where logging had occurred, mostly thinning in previous years. And you can see the fire just swept right through those areas, mostly very fast, very intensely. And now most of Greenville is gone. So I start with that because I want us to understand a key dichotomy. The difference is two competing approaches. One, the current one that we're still pursuing as a society and policymakers and agencies, is what we call from the wildlands in. That's the approach where we basically double down on backcountry logging, tree removal. We call it fuel reduction, we call it thinning, we call it other things. And we tell communities that's going to save them from fire while keeping the forest healthy. The other is, which is diametrically opposed, is called from the home out. And that approach actually focuses on protecting forests from logging and diverts the resources away from logging subsidies and instead diverts those resources into funds to help homeowners make their homes fire safe, home hardening, and also into a jobs program to create defensible space around vulnerable communities and around those homes. And so I wanted to start with that. And I'm just going to go a little bit deeper here and talk about the climate crisis, which of course is driving so many things, including influencing wildfires. Wildfires are driven primarily by weather and climate, and therefore also climate change. It's not so much about how many trees there are. In fact, it usually works the opposite way. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the reality is that a lot of people don't realize that we have to do not one, but two things to overcome the climate crisis. We cannot merely Move away from fossil fuels. That is essential, but it's not enough. We will not overcome the climate crisis if we only move away from fossil fuels. And the reason is simple. Once we put all that excess CO2 into the atmosphere from human activities, meaning fossil fuel consumption and logging, once we do that, the excess, that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a very, very long time, many, many decades, even centuries. And the only way to reverse that is to, number one, stop putting so much up there, but also then to draw it down. And that means protecting a lot more forests so they can absorb a lot more CO2 from the atmosphere. Right now, we're at 421 parts per million of CO2 equivalents in our atmosphere. We need to be well below 350. And forest protection is our key way to get there below 350, and protection of other natural habitats that can absorb CO2. And in fact, forest protection can be as much as half of the needed climate change mitigation. And it's a big, big deal. And so we really need to scale up in terms of our attention on this, in terms of our funding, in terms of our pressure on policymakers to make sure that we don't keep pulling carbon out of our forests and shooting ourselves in the foot from a climate change mitigation standpoint. And that's really what I want to address for the rest of the presentation, is a number of harmful myths and misconceptions that are getting in the way of our progress to not only protect communities effectively from wildfire, but also to mitigate the climate crisis that threatens all of us. And that's really the focus of my book, Smokescreen, is addressing and dispelling those myths and misconceptions. So I'll talk about a few here. First one I want to talk about is what I call the overgrown forest myth. And I'm sure everyone's heard this many, many times in various ways. This idea that the forests are overgrown, they're overstocked, they have far too many trees, live trees, dead trees. There's far too much fuel in the forest. That's what we're being told by the US Forest Service, by logging companies, and by members of Congress or state legislators who are aligned in one way or another with logging interests. We are told that therefore the solution is to roll back environmental laws and increase subsidies for logging, because removing trees from forests will reduce fuel and curb wildfires. That's what we're being told. Now, that is absolutely not consistent with the best available science, and I will talk about that a little bit right now. So, first off, in every region of this country, current forest carbon storage levels are far lower than the biological potential of those forests. And that is fundamentally a function of decades, and in some cases, well over a century, of removals of carbon through logging. In other words, we've been removing vast amounts of carbon from our forests from various types of logging operations, whether it's clear cutting or whether it's commercial thinning, for many, many decades. And that has left our forests in a situation where they are far below their biological capacity to store carbon. So that's the bad news, because most of that carbon is in the atmosphere right now. The good news is that that also means that if we protect our forests from logging, if we make bold steps to do that and redirect those logging subsidies away from logging and instead into other things, that our forests can absorb a lot more CO2 than they're absorbing right now, and that will accelerate climate change mitigation instead of accelerating climate change. Interestingly, one of the key myths is if forests are denser, if they have more biomass, that somehow they're going to burn more intensely because there's more fuel. That's the narrative. And it seems intuitively correct on the surface, and that's why so many people believe it. The problem is that there are stacks of scientific studies that say the opposite. In fact, the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence tells us that denser forests, more mature forests, older forests, forests with more biomass, more carbon, tend to burn at equal or lower intensities when wildland fires occur. And this is just a graph from one of those studies, and I have a few others cited, but there are many, many studies on this. And it just shows that as biomass goes up, the fire severity, which is that black line toward the top middle of the image, that fire severity goes down overall. And how can that be? Well, it turns out that there are countervailing factors. So when a forest is denser, on the one hand, yeah, you would think it has more to burn, but it also has more cooling shade of that forest canopy cover, because denser forests have higher canopy cover, more trees, more big trees. And that means that everything on the forest floor stays more moist, more shaded, more cool during fire season. Denser stand trees means you have a windbreak against the winds that drive flames. Whereas when you remove trees from forests, you get hotter, drier, and windier conditions that are more conducive to a more rapid rate of spread. Now, for a similar reason, contrary to the constant drumbeat that we hear on this from certain policymakers, from the Forest Service, and in some segments of the media, contrary to that, when forests have not burned in a very, very long time, if they do burn in a wildfire, they don't tend to burn more intensely. We hear that the forests are so overgrown and they haven't burned in such a long time, many of the forests, that we can't just let wildfire happen, because if it happens, that the forests are all just going to burn up. They're going to burn way too intensely because of so-called fuel accumulation. And the messaging that we're hearing is, therefore, we must, again, roll back environmental laws and increase logging before we can let fire into our forests. That is absolutely not true. Forests burn mostly at low and moderate intensity, regardless of whether they have burned 10 or 15 years earlier, or whether they burned 100 years earlier or more. They burn mostly at low and moderate intensity. Now, if they burned less than 10 years earlier, that certainly will modify fire behavior to some degree, but it's still going to be mixed intensity. But the big thing that people don't realize is that after about 10 or 12 years after the last fire, it doesn't just increase in its potential for more severe fire. It basically just kind of flattens off. And in many cases, actually gets less likely to burn at high intensity, which is the figure you see here. TSF means time since fire. And you can see in those most long unburned forests, the ones that haven't burned in over 75 years, they actually had the least amount of high severity fire. That's that black bar on the bottom of that column. That's Odian et al. 2010, and I've published research on this too, so have many others. The overwhelming weight of science finds that forests that haven't burned in a long time, which tend to be the densest forests, they typically have mostly low and moderate severity fire. They don't tend to burn more severely than other forests, which is good news, because that means we can and should allow more fire in our wildland forests when there are lightning strikes that are not close to a community. Now, as I said before, forest fires are driven mainly by weather and climate factors, not by forest density or how many dead trees there are or any of those things. Those are very, very secondary, and they don't tend to work in the direction that the Forest Service would like the public to believe. And I'll talk about that in a second. Turns out that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging, the most tree removal, those forests tend to burn the most intensely, oftentimes toward vulnerable communities. And that's even true in this. That's even when you control for the same forest type. That's the case. And I was a co-author of this study. It's the largest scientific analysis ever done on this question, Bradley et al. 2016. Other research finds similar things. Sure, a thin forest, will burn at low intensity or moderate intensity sometimes, but more often than not, they'll burn at equal or higher intensities than an unthinned forest, for some of the reasons we talked about. I mentioned earlier. Thinning, logging under the guise of thinning, affects the forest microclimate. It reduces the cooling shade of the canopy cover, creates hotter, drier, and windier conditions. And I found this to be the case in a study I recently published just last year in the Creek Fire, which was a fire that burned in 2020, 380,000 acre fire in southern Sierra Nevada. And I found that the forests that had previous commercial thinning and forests with previous post-fire logging, those are the areas that burned the most intensely. And forests that had little or no previous forest management actually burned less intensely. Now, I found a similar thing with regard to one of the big fires in California last year, the Antelope Fire. I looked at this and I found that commercial thinning increases overall fire severity and tree mortality relative to just fire alone and no intervention. And a big part of that is that thinning, of course, kills a lot of the trees before the fire ever gets there. So when you look at the cumulative effect of that, it's really significant. And we're finding that thinning is a major mortality event and agent, oftentimes more significant than the fire itself, but certainly at a minimum, causing a cumulative effect that it's killing a lot more trees than it's preventing from being killed. That is not the way to go. And another thing we're finding is that a lot of the satellite imagery used by the Forest Service to report so-called success of thinning in certain areas, when we look closely at those areas, we find that the satellite imagery has been calibrated in a way that underreports the amount of high severity fire in thinned forests, and it is disproportionate. And so when we actually correct for that, we find that the thin forests actually have higher severity than the unthinned forests. But there's a glitch in the satellite imagery that needs to be recalibrated. We talk about that, by the way, in a paper we came out with earlier this year called De La Sala et al. 2022 in Biological Conservation. Another conclusion we came to is that the whole series of studies in the past 15 years authored by Forest Service scientists that claimed that thinning was effective as a wildfire management strategy, it turns out the results of those studies actually do not support that conclusion. We did a deep dive on that, and it turns out that the results support a very different conclusion. And so I'd urge folks that want to look at this closely to check out that study, as well as, of course, my book, Smokescreen. One of the other big myths is that forests with a lot of dead trees will burn much more intensely. Well, it turns out most of the research, including my own, I've published a couple of studies on this, most of the research finds that there's just no relationship between dead trees and fire behavior, not rate of spread, not fire intensity. The reason is simple. Once trees die, very quickly, the dead needles and leaves and small twigs fall to the ground and they decay into soil. There's just not that much to carry flames after that. And when they fall, of course, they soak up enormous amounts of moisture, a lot of water. But at least one study found that forests with more dead trees actually burn less intensely. This is Meigs et al. 2016. And you see that over time, after the trees die, the fire intensity potential actually goes down, not up. And like I said, once those dead trees fall to the ground, they act like giant sponges. They can soak up and retain 25 times more water per unit of volume than the surrounding soil, even in a drought year. Remarkable. And this is one of the factors. Of course, trees contain a lot of water, and especially dead trees, down logs. And the next one, the last one actually I'll talk about before we do Q&A is what I call the catastrophic wildfire myth. And that's basically this notion that we hear all the time that the fires are burning so hot that they sterilize the soil and nothing will grow back unless we do post-fire logging and plant trees artificially to reforest and restore the forest. That's what we're hearing from the logging industry and the Forest Service. That's absolutely not true. Once again, first of all, even the biggest fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. This is the Rim Fire, 2013 fire in the central Sierra Nevada, burned 257,000 acres. And one of the things that misleads people is just the color coding. You see this bright red, and it really draws your eye. I ask people all the time when I give presentations what they estimate the red to be. And the red is high severity in this mapping here. And people think, well, it's 35%, maybe it's 40%. It's actually 19.9%. Just under 20% is the high severity. The rest of it's low and moderate, where most of the trees survive, especially the mature trees. And similar thing in many, many other fires. This is the Wallow Fire of 2011, Eastern Arizona, 565,000 acre fire. And this was less than 10% high severity. It's very, very common. Some are 30, 35%, some are 20%, some are 8%. They vary, but they are overwhelmingly dominated by low and moderate severity effects. And interestingly, historically, before fire suppression and logging, in the Western US mixed conifer and dry pine forests, it was pretty common to have 20 to 35% of the fire effects be high severity. It was still dominated by low and moderate severity historically, but high severity was still a significant component. And that's important, and I'll explain that why that matters so much in a little bit. And of course, there's stacks and stacks of peer-reviewed studies backing this up, a lot of which, of course, I have cited in the endnotes of Smokescreen book. This is just a map that was done by U.S. Geological Survey researchers over the course of an 8-year field survey in the northern Sierra Nevada in the late 1800s. And those white polygons with the cross hatching, those are large, high severity fire patches. They didn't even map anything less than 80 acres. Those are all large ones. And some of these are thousands, even a few of them tens of thousands of acres in size. And the point is that while most of the landscape was dominated by low and moderate severity, occasionally, especially in drought years and hot, dry, windy conditions, you would get big fire years and big fires. And you would get a lot of high severity, including some really large patches, thousands of acres in size. And this is just a quote from those same U.S. Geological Survey researchers. There are many, many quotes like this in this report to Congress from 1902, and it just talks about this heterogeneity, these dense areas of old forest with live trees next to these areas that burned hot with the standing dead trees and the native shrubs and all the regenerating conifers coming up through the shrubs. Really, really important, that heterogeneity, that juxtaposition. And we actually call that component where most or all the trees are killed, we call that snag forest habitat. And it turns out that snag forest habitat is incredibly biodiverse and ecologically rich. So very contrary to the catastrophic wildfire narrative that we hear all the time, that these areas are destroyed and the wildlife habitat is lost. The fire is actually creating habitat. Certainly it's a change. Some species really prefer forests that are mostly comprised of live trees and have a lot of canopy cover, at least for some part of their life cycle. But a lot of others like it hot. They like forests, they prefer forests, they need forests and depend on them if they have been burned hot and where most or all the trees have been killed by fire or by pockets of drought and bark beetle mortality where you have most of the trees killed. That snag forest is incredibly rich. There are many species that have evolved to depend on it. And this is one of them. In the top frame there, that's the blackback woodpecker. That is a species I've been studying for about 2 decades now. It's highly dependent on snag forest habitat. They need forests with over 100 medium and large snags per acre. For one pair, you're talking about 200 or 300 acres that they want, and they'll share that at the edges with other woodpeckers, but they're territorial in most of it. And of course, there's lots of other species that use that depend on those woodpeckers to create cavities for them, like the western bluebirds and mountain bluebirds and nuthatches and many small mammals like chipmunks. They depend on the woodpeckers to create the cavities for them. But you have to have dead trees because the woodpeckers need those. They're softer than live trees, so they can excavate nest cavities. And fire-killed trees are the key thing that native wood-boring beetles need to reproduce. And the woodpeckers eat the larvae of those wood-boring beetles, thousands of them every single year. Got to have a lot of dead trees to have enough native wood-boring beetle larvae to have enough food for the woodpeckers so they can do their job and create homes for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest. And the blackback woodpecker is incredibly adapted to patches of snag forest habitat that have been created by high intensity fire. And their camouflage, their natural camouflage that they've evolved is a key indicator of that. I was standing about 20 feet from this blackback woodpecker when I took this picture. It's a female. She was just kind of went quiet because they know they're camouflaged and they can wait till you just pass by. So just take a moment, see if you can actually find her against the charred bark of that fire-killed tree. Most people can't. All right, so the tip of the arrow is touching the top of her head. That's how perfectly camouflaged she is. That's how wonderfully adapted, how elegant and beautiful the evolutionary process is in shaping this ecosystem. And this is one where it's easy to see him because the bark had flaked off in this particular spot. This is a male blackback woodpecker feeding a chick some grubs, wood-boring beetle larvae. This is in the Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe area. And it's not just blackback woodpeckers. It turns out that for bird species overall, total bird abundance is often highest in forests with the highest fire intensities, completely contrary to what we're being told under this catastrophic wildfire myth, this narrative. That narrative is, well, the hotter it burns, the less biodiversity you're going to have. Turns out that's only true if they get post-fire logged. Then, of course, you do have very low biodiversity. You have very low wildlife abundance. But if these post-fire habitats are not subjected to destructive post-fire logging, they are ecological treasures, and they're highly biodiverse, just like old-growth forests. In fact, they're comparable to old-growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. It's also true for spotted owls. So we know that spotted owls nest and roost in primarily in low and moderate intensity fire areas or unburned forests where it's mostly live trees and high canopy cover. But it turns out people weren't really asking the question until more recently: where do they go to get their food? Where do they prefer to hunt? Turns out they prefer to hunt in the snag forest, because snag forest habitat has a small mammal prey base because of the shrubs and the regenerating conifer seedlings and saplings and the down logs and the snags. It's great habitat for small mammals that the spotted owls prey on. And that small mammal prey base is 2 to 6 times higher in the snag forest than it is in unburned or lightly burned old forest. And if you remove that snag forest through post-fire logging, the spotted owls are very adversely affected by that, and their populations decline steeply if post-fire logging occurs. We call that, by the way, the effect, where they nest and roost in the lightly burned old forest and they forage in the snag forest. We call that the bed and breakfast effect. And one thing I'll just mention briefly also is that there's a lot less wildfire in our forests now than we had historically. They have been going up, and part of that is driven by climate change. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is we still have substantially less fire in our forests than we had naturally before fire suppression. And I just point that out because it's more good news emerging from the science that we don't need to lament an additional increase in fire in our forests. It's not destroying our forests. It's actually a rejuvenating force. We don't want too much fire, but we also don't want too little. And another key myth is this idea that wildfires are a carbon bomb in our forests when they occur. We hear from Forest Service scientists in the press. They say, well, you know, the trees are mostly consumed in these big fires. They paint this picture where the trees are largely incinerated and the carbon goes into the atmosphere, and you just have these sort of stubs of trees on the ground after fires. And of course, anyone who's seen post-fire habitat or hiked through it knows that's not true. The trees are still there, the branches are there, even the twigs are still there in most cases. And only the outer surface of the bark and maybe the needles has been consumed, and oftentimes not even that. We just finished a 4.5-year field study we published earlier this year, Harmon et al. 2022. I was a co-author, and we found, similar to other studies, that even in the biggest forest fires, only about 2% of tree carbon is actually consumed. And that includes both trees that survive the fire and trees that are killed. As a consequence, the current models are vastly overstating the amount of carbon emissions from wildfires. And it's compounded by the fact that none of those models account for post-fire carbon uptake and absorption by all the regeneration, all the natural regeneration and forest regrowth after the fire. Shrubs, oaks, conifers, all growing in and accelerating that growth every single year, spurred on by the nutrient cycling from the fire. And this is just this is the rim fire in a large high intensity fire patch at 8 years post-fire. This is last year. This is Dr. James Hanson, world-renowned climate scientist, and myself. I'm on the right. And this is a standing in one among many areas where the Forest Service said the forest would maybe never naturally regenerate because it burned too hot and it was too far away from a live tree seed source. Or if it did naturally regenerate, it would take many decades, maybe even centuries. Well, this is at 8 years post-fire, and the natural forest regrowth is already over the tops of our heads. We prevent service from or artificially planting this area. This is all natural. Right next door, the same high intensity fire patch, just a stone's throw away. This is the other Dr. Hanson and I standing in a stump field where the Forest Service clear cut this area, and then artificially planted it under the guise of restoration, fuel reduction, and reforestation. Take a look and assess for yourself whether you think that makes sense based on this. Most of what they planted died because of all the damage from the logging machinery on the fragile post-fire soils, all the nutrient removal as the trees were removed. The regeneration needs those trees. And there's a lot of invasive grasses that were brought in by the logging machinery. Another example, this is in the middle of one of the two biggest high-intensity fire patches in the entire rimfire. This is way deep in the interior. It's more than 1,000 feet away from the nearest surviving tree in any direction. And this is all natural post-fire regeneration at 8 years post-fire. For scale, these conifer saplings are already about 12 feet tall in this picture, and that was last summer. And right next door, same high-intensity fire patch, just a stone's throw away, the Forest Service had logged this area and planted, and this is what it looks like. In both of these cases I just showed you, the post-fire logging had happened 5 years earlier, or almost closer to 6 years earlier in the first case. And this is what it still looks like today. And now, of course, to be clear, when they plant, sometimes the trees do survive, and there's variability there. But this sort of situation and outcome is shockingly common. Now, this is more good news emerging from the science. It turns out, giant sequoias are incredibly fire resistant. Many, perhaps most of the giant sequoias, mature ones that the Forest Service and government has been claiming were killed in recent fires are actually not dead. We've been going and looking at them, and they actually produce new green crown foliage after the fires, even when they burn at high intensity. And it turns out also that giant sequoias reproduce best by far if the fire burns at moderate or high intensity. In other words, intense enough to kill at least some of the mature sequoias, or at least scorch them, far up the trunks and burn the duff and litter on the forest floor, so those seedlings can take root, and so the cones can release the seeds. And in the low intensity areas in the sequoia groves, there's very, very little reproduction. Biggest conservation threat to giant sequoias is actually a lack of reproduction. And what we're seeing now is after these fires, some mature sequoias are killed. There's no question about that. It's not a bad thing. Giant sequoia snags are incredible wildlife habitat for many, many decades, but it's not nearly as many mature sequoias are killed as has been reported. And what hasn't been reported is the good news that the reproduction is now off the charts in sequoia groves that have had almost no reproduction for over a century. And because of all that post-fire regrowth, forests become a carbon sink again, absorbing more CO2 than they emit, and oftentimes less than a decade after fire because of the nutrient cycling and all that vigorous post-fire regeneration. Now, our forests could absorb a lot more carbon, however, if we protected them from logging and protected large areas, vast areas. First, our public lands, but also acquiring more forest lands from private owners who are willing sellers, and acquire them into protected public ownership. This could be an enormous climate change mitigation effort, and we really need to put our shoulder into it. One of the key threats is biomass logging, which is basically removing trees from forests and burning them for energy, which actually emits even more CO2 than burning coal for equal energy produced. So that's not a solution. This is an example of biomass logging in the rimfire in the Sierra Nevada. We call this clear cuts for kilowatts, and it is a climate change disaster, and it's something we all need to push back on. And same thing with commercial thinning. It removes a substantial portion of the carbon from the forest, and most of that carbon goes into the atmosphere. Importantly, only a minor portion of it ends up in a wood product somewhere. Most of it is incinerated in biomass plants and at the mill for energy production. And basically these days, logging is mostly dirty energy. A lot of people don't realize that either. And in fact, logging in US forests emits about 10 times more carbon each year than wildfire and native bark beetles combined. Logging is the carbon bomb, not fire, not bark beetles. And including commercial thinning, that emits 3 times more CO2 per acre than wildfire alone. commercial thinning is has a significant climate change impact. And this is just a graph from Ingerson 2007, just kind of explaining what happens to the carbon in the trees and how it turns into CO2 and goes into the atmosphere, and what a tiny percentage, really small percentage of a given tree that's removed actually ends up in a wood product. The branches are incinerated, the treetops incinerated, the bark, the round parts, the mill residue, and only a small part is left that ends up in a lumber product. And so most of the carbon in the trees, if they're removed from forests through logging, that ends up in the atmosphere. And it's something we really need to talk about more as a society. Wrapping it all up, what does it all mean? It means beware of any legislation or any policymakers promoting legislation under the guise of forest health, fuel reduction, or restoration. These are insidious euphemisms for commercial logging that's making climate change worse, harming wildlife habitat, and generally making fires burn faster and hotter toward communities. And so beware of the euphemisms, and support legislation that would protect public lands from logging, or end logging subsidies, and acquire more private forest lands into protected public ownership. Of course, you can get more information in my book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And I will stop screen share there, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
So thank you very much. Very, very important. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Nancy Johnson will be forwarding the questions to Chad.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Dr. Hanson, there are a number of questions already from Darlene. How successful have you been educating fire departments, realtors, and how to protect homes in forested areas?
Yeah, great question. So we have made a lot of progress on that, but we also have a long way to go. So the conversation about focusing on homes themselves and the immediate zone around homes, home hardening and defensible space, it really wasn't even a conversation 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. It was barely talked about at all. And we were trying, but we have made great strides. A lot of different organizations working on this. Sierra Club included has done a really wonderful job in recent years in educating the public about the importance of focusing on homes. And so that's become a bigger part of the conversation. And there has been some funding in some legislative vehicles at state and federal levels to increase home hardening and defensible space. However, it's still a small portion of the overall wildfire management and wildfire response budget. And in terms of the money allocated, most of the money still is going to backcountry logging and backcountry fire suppression. And that's what needs to change. So we have a ways to go, but we have made progress.
Great, thank you. And a question from Norman. Do standing dead trees also store large amounts of water like downed trees?
They do. Standing dead trees also store water, but not as much as when they fall, but they definitely do still store water. They soak it up from the ambient air. They absorb it from the soil. They retain it from rainfall and snowmelt. And so trees have a lot of water in them, live and dead. But the main thing as far as dead trees go is that they're carbon storage in the forest, which is key. They are incredible wildlife habitat. I mean, for cavity nesting species, I mean, a dead tree is off the charts in terms of its importance for homes for wildlife and the cavities it can provide and the food in terms of native insects. But from a fire perspective, they just don't contribute much to fire behavior. What fires are driven by weather and climate mostly, but you have to have something to burn, of course. But mostly it's pine needles, it's dry leaves, it's small twigs. It's really fine stuff. And anyone who's ever built a campfire, of course, knows this.
Great. Okay, thank you. A couple questions about thinning. One, and this is from Robin, do you equate forest thinning with selective cutting? And number two from Connie, do you find that thinning actually diminishes the variety of food the birds and wildlife can access?
Yeah, great questions. So in terms of terminology, yes, what they call these days commercial thinning is what 20, 30 years ago they used to call selective logging. It's really the same thing for the most part. Functionally, there's really no difference in terms of, because I was involved in this issue back then as well, and what they were calling selective logging is just what they call thinning now. It just wasn't really the terminology. And frankly, I think this is mostly a political term. I mean, this is a big theme in my book, Smokescreen, is the way deceptive language has been used to promote the same old logging in the past, but to confuse people, to think it's something different. People hear the term thinning and they think pruning shears. They don't realize it's chainsaws and bulldozers and big trees rolling down the highway on log trucks. And as far as the second question, removing wildlife habitat and food for wildlife. Yeah, thinning is really removes a lot of the structural complexity and a lot of the wildlife habitat and food. A lot of people don't realize thinning doesn't just remove trees, live trees, it also removes a lot of the dead trees. In the typical commercial thinning project, they're removing most of the snags as well. And of course, that has serious impacts on wildlife in addition to the removal of the live trees.
Great, thank you. And a question from Janice: have warmer winters increasing bark beetle survival and reproduction and non-native pathogens like adelgids had any additive impacts, or are there impacts similar to historic native bark beetle contributions to heterogeneity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I'm really glad that this question was asked, because kind of like I was saying before about fire, you don't want too much, you don't want too little. To put a fine point on it, you really want a significant amount of snag forest habitat on the landscape, but you don't want too much or too little of that either. And so the question is, where are we with that, with regard to bark beetles and drought, with regard to high intensity fire? Both of those things can create snag forest habitat in various patches. And what the strong weight of science indicates right now is that we are getting closer to natural levels, but we are still below natural levels in terms of how much snag forest habitat is on the landscape. It's a fairly small minority of the landscape, even if you see a big patch here and there. Most of the forests are mid-successional, late successional, or old growth, mostly live trees. In the Sierra Nevada, for example, historically, snag forest habitat comprised in mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forest, it comprised between generally 20 to 30%, sometimes up to 40%, but usually about 20 to 30% of the forest overall. And the rest was mid-successional, late successional, and old growth forest. And of course, the snag forest is, snags and the shrubs, but also the young regenerating trees before they've gotten big enough and old enough to be called mid-successional. So that was 20 to 30% historically before fire suppression and logging. Today, with the recent big fires, with the recent big drought that happened over several years ago, snag forest habitat comprises 10 to 12% of the forests in the Sierra Nevada in these forest types, mixed conifer and ponderosa pine. And so, not that long ago, it was only 6 or 7%. So it's definitely more, and that's a good thing, because we want it to be in that 20 to 30% range. We don't want it to be 50 or 60 or 70%. That would be too much. But we shouldn't lament it if it goes from 10 or 12 up to 20.
Okay, great, thank you. Brian asked, don't some trees like sequoia trees need the heat of fires to facilitate reproduction?
Yes, great question. Yeah, so that is called serotiny. There are certain conifer species. Lots of conifers have different adaptations to fire, but there are certain conifer species that have really strong associations where they actually need fire that burns intensely enough to melt the resins in the cones to help release the seeds. And those are ones that tend to be, evolutionarily kind of more adapted to moderate and high intensity fire. Turns out giant sequoias are serotinous. Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine is another serotinous species. There's a number of them, actually, quite a few. And giant sequoia really needs that. They need the heat, the fire to burn hot enough, intensely enough to melt the resins, release the seeds. kill enough of the overstory trees to increase the sunlight, because the seedlings really need that with giant sequoias, and then also consume that thick duff and litter on the forest floor in the giant sequoia groves so the seedlings can take root and also create this nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash that helps the seedlings survive and establish and grow and accelerate in their growth over the following decades. And so that's really how they do best. So yeah, great question. It's absolutely right. Giant sequoias, among many other conifer species, benefit greatly, not just from wildfire, but in particular from moderate and high intensity fire.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Gayla Shoemake asks, where do the Forest Service scientists get their education? Why are they still so tied into the logging industry? And how do we change that? Right.
Well, thank you. Great question. I mean, some of this is about, education, where a lot of the folks who work for the Forest Service get their information from forestry schools. And as I think, probably most folks on the call here know, in most forestry schools, they're really teaching you not so much about forest ecology or climate science. They're teaching you how to efficiently extract trees from the forest as timber commodities. And so there is that bias, certainly. But frankly, for me, I think the deeper thing is just the system, the structure that's set up. Under the current laws, the U.S. Forest Service is allowed to and encouraged to sell public trees to private logging companies and keep the revenue. So it's financially incentivized to do logging and to promote logging, even at the expense of the truth, at the expense of the biodiversity, at the expense of the climate, or even communities. And basically, the current laws put good people in a bad position so that they are incentivized to behave badly. And fundamentally, that's an issue for Congress to resolve. Congress needs to change the laws to get the U.S. Forest Service out of the commercial logging business, which is a position the Sierra Club has supported since 1996 and continues to, as a key measure for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. And so I think what we need to do is put pressure on our members of Congress, including the ones who are friendly in most respects, to step up on forest protection for the good of the climate and communities and biodiversity.
Great, thank you. Jessica has a couple questions. Have you ever compared the habitat potential of burned forests to commercial forest land after it's been cleared and sprayed with herbicides? That's question number one. And question number two is, you showed slide comparisons of the difference in forest regeneration. Why are those replanted areas treated by commercial forest practices not regenerating? Are summer heat conditions due to climate change limiting the growth of seedlings, or is that something else?
All right, so I'll take those in turn. Let's see, the first one was
the habitat potential of burned forest to commercial. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of studies on this that have been published on this, on the extreme ecological harm caused by post-fire logging and the high ecological value of snagged forest habitat that is allowed to naturally regenerate and not planted, and where the snags are left alone and not cut down. I talk about in great detail about this research and have them cited in the endnotes in my book, Smokescreen. So for folks who want to learn more about that, you can get all kinds of information about that in my book. Second question was
slide comparisons of the difference in forest regeneration. Why are the replanted areas treated?
Right. Thank you. Yes. So the main reason is when post-fire logging occurs, first thing that happens when those snags are being cut down is that the logging machinery literally rolls over and crushes and kills most of the naturally regenerating conifer seedlings and saplings. And so that's the first thing that happens. It's a big setback just by killing most of the natural regeneration. But in addition, the logging machinery compacts and damages the fragile post-fire soils. And then, of course, the dead trees are removed. And otherwise, those dead trees would fall and decay and provide nutrients for the regrowing forest. And so for that combination of reasons, these areas that are post-fire logged have far less natural regeneration. And then when trees are artificially planted, as reforestation. That's the terminology. It's a little misleading. When that happens, most of them die in many cases. And sometimes most of them survive, but it's very common for most of them to die in these post-fire logged areas, especially if you come back, 3 or 4 years later. It doesn't all happen the first year. And sorry, the third question was, if you don't mind.
Are summer heat conditions due to climate change limiting the growth? Did you already answer that?
I didn't. It's a great question. It's interesting. I guess what I can say is, you would expect drought and heat to have an effect, and I certainly expect that. What I can say, which is, again, good news emerging from the research, because a lot of this is good news if we actually just pay attention to the science, is that I published a number of studies on post-fire natural regeneration in large, high-intensity fire patches in forests. And I'm working on more research right now. And what I can say is I'm documenting very high and vigorous natural post-fire regrowth during extreme drought periods. And if it wasn't a drought, would there be even more? Probably. I would expect so. You would think so. It makes sense. But I guess the good news is that even during droughts, we're still seeing a lot of natural regeneration, an abundance of it, which is really, really good news, if it's not post-fire logged.
Well, we've actually gone over our time. And so how about one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
So a couple people are asking, what are we going to build with?
Yeah, great question. Really glad you asked that too, someone. And I talk about this a lot in my book, Smokescreen, about what the alternatives are. But the first one, of course, is before we even talk about alternatives, I think that we really need to talk about reducing our consumption. It wasn't that long ago, the average American home was 1,000 or 1,200 square feet. The home my wife grew up in a family of 4, was 1,000 square feet. It's perfectly great, adequate sized home, 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It's laid out really intelligently and no waste of space. Doesn't feel small at all. And that was common in a lot of the homes built in the 60s and even in the 70s. And then it became 1,600 square feet was the norm. And then it became 2,000. And then it became, everyone wanted a 4,000 square foot home. And, that's a choice. And we can make different choices, and we need to make different choices. So the first thing is just we need to reduce our consumption. The second thing is, of course, we can use a lot more recycled and reclaimed materials and reduce our impacts on forests that way. But the third one is just to use non-wood alternatives. Non-wood alternatives for paper. We don't need to cut down trees for paper, including toilet paper. We don't need to. We can't afford to. Lots of great alternatives for paper that don't come from trees. Recycle alternatives, of course, but also non-wood alternatives for building. There's a lot of them. Recycled light gauge steel is better than wood. It has a lower carbon footprint. It has much less impact on ecosystems. It still has a carbon footprint, but it's lower than wood if you do a full cost accounting, an honest one. But the one I like a lot recently is hempcrete. It wasn't until 2019 that growing industrial hemp became legal in this country, but now it is, and in other countries. And companies are producing hempcrete, which is a product usually out of blocks that are very cost effective relative to wood. The construction time is far less than wood construction. It's fireproof essentially, and it's slightly carbon negative, unlike wood, which is a massive carbon emitter. And the main problem is that all these non-wood alternatives are competing against logging subsidies. They're competing against a market that's being artificially influenced with the thumb on the scale in favor of the logging industry. And then we need to stop that. And I think these other alternatives will gain ground.
Great. Well, thank you so very much. I really appreciate your extra time and answering the questions.
Oh, my pleasure.
I have one more. I have
Sure,
one
go
more.
ahead.
What about our giant sequoias during climate change? Are we going to lose them from?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's a great question. In fact, I am very optimistic about giant sequoias unless people, the kind of opportunism and cynicism turns to more logging in sequoia groves, which a lot of people are proposing right now. But if we don't do that, and if we protect them from logging, what I'm seeing right now is that there's very low mortality of mature sequoias in these fires, including in a lot of the high intensity fire patches. Certainly some are killed, there's no question about that, but far less than has been reported recently. That is just wildly exaggerated. And I'm doing field work on this right now. But the big story for me is the reproduction. The reproduction is off the charts of giant sequoias. Wow. Amazing regrowth. In some cases, in 5 years, over the top of my head, 7, 8 feet tall, in 5, 6 years, in these high intensity fire patches or moderate intensity patches of giant sequoia reproduction in groves that have had almost no reproduction in over a century because of fire suppression. So we've been kind of loving our giant sequoia groves to death, thinking we're saving them from fire, when in reality, fire is the thing they need the most. I also saw briefly, there was a comment, a question about Native American cultural burning. And I just wanted to say that I think we need more of 3 types of fire. We need more managed wildfire, also called prescribed natural fire. That's just letting more lightning strikes burn for habitat benefit in forests that are not next to a community. So we need more of that, more just wildland fire. We need prescribed fire during fire season in certain areas, especially as an additional buffer around communities after defensible space and home hardening has been effectively done. I think that can be effective. And we need more Native American cultural burning. And we need to reduce administrative barriers and hurdles that have been inhibiting Native American cultural burning for many, many decades in a very unfair and biased way. I think we need more of all those things. What we don't need more of is logging.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chad.
My pleasure.
Really
thank you. And thanks for the great
it.
questions.
Everybody, try to read the book Smokescreen.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. And thanks everyone for taking the time to talk about this important subject. And feel free to follow up if people have questions. My email address, I'll put it in the chat. It's cthanson1@gmail.com.